Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Triangle SciTech Expo with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Nancy, and I will be your host for this very informative program where we will learn about how DNA teaches us about diet and the microbiome in kids. So, with me is Dr. Sarah Armstrong and Dr. Lawrence David from Duke University and they will talk about this very interesting topic. And we would like to get the chat actually started. And so we would like to know from you or hear from you what your favorite food is, or it could be fruit or vegetable. And you can type that in the chat. But while you're thinking about that question, we will have a quick tutorial for those who are joining us in Zoom. Those who are joining us in YouTube don't have to worry about that because we are going to make sure that you have the perfect view. But if you are in Zoom, we actually have our closed captions available. So what you're going to have to do is click on that CC button at the bottom of your bar right here, and then click on the show subtitles. Then if you are in gallery view, all those boxes of the speakers and the guests are gonna obscure the slideshow. So what you wanna do is you wanna click on speaker view. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna select the top and kind of like go to the side-by-side mode. That way, your speaker box will be next to your slideshow. And if you want to have the speaker bigger or smaller, you can just move that little slide bar to the left or to the right. And then last but not least, we do want to hear from you because Dr. Sarah and Dr. Lawrence, they really want to, they're going to ask questions and they really want to have it interactive. So please put your answers in that chat. Also, if you have questions for them, put them in the chat as well. We will try to have them answer as many questions as we can. And also, if you have some comments, put that in the chat as well. Just, be kind and, make sure that they are appropriate and to the topic. Just be, good digital citizens. And so with that, I would like to introduce our speakers. So we have Dr. Sarah Armstrong. She is a general pediatrician with expertise in child and adolescent nutrition and weight management at Duke University. And she studies how children and families are able to achieve best health through good nutrition and physical activity. She lives in Chapel Hill with her husband, 3 children, and 2 dogs, and loves to go hiking on the Eno and cook Italian food. Now, Dr. Lawrence David is an engineer and microbial ecologist at Duke University, and he works on finding ways to use diet to manage gut bacterial communities. And Lawrence lives in Chapel Hill with his wife, 2 kids, and a flock of chickens. So when not in the lab, he enjoys playing tennis and going camping. So Dr. Sarah and Dr. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And hello and welcome to everybody there on Zoom and on YouTube. And thanks so much for joining us. As Nancy mentioned, I'm Sarah Armstrong, and I'm a general pediatrician, which means I do regular checkups for kids. And I feel so lucky to get to work with Lawrence David, who's a super smart scientist. And just want to encourage everybody to remember that science is a team sport. And so it takes all of us working together to be able to answer some of these hard questions. So I'm really grateful I don't have to go it alone because this is complicated stuff and super fun to work in teams. So today, Lawrence and I are going to talk with you all a little bit about the gut microbiome, all of the bacteria and viruses and other things that live inside of us and how they actually affect our own health. And in fact, you might not know it, but there's more of them than there are of us. So if your whole body was to disappear, you would see a shadow ghost of your microbiome walking around. So super cool stuff. And they're really important and how we're healthy. So Lawrence is going to talk a little bit about the science of the microbiome and how we can see these little creatures that affect our health and live in and on us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our health and how the microbiome influences how we are healthy. Lawrence?
Thanks so much, Sarah. And as Sarah was saying, one of the really exciting things that microbiologists and other people who study bacteria have discovered, particularly over the past couple of years, is how our bodies, in fact, all animals are covered in bacteria. And what I mean by covered is that on all of our epithelial surfaces, which include both our skin, as well as things like the lining of our guts, there are big groups or communities of bacteria that live together. Inside of us, when you add it all up, that's something like 100 trillion bacteria, which is a really big number. But a lot of them live in the gut and are in poop when it comes out. And if you count even just a single gram of poop, so that's something like the size of like a dice, there are 100 billion bacteria in one of those, which is more than the number of stars in the Milky Way. It's a really, really big population, and we should all be proud that you carry around these. It's almost like the universe's largest zoo is living inside of you, and somehow it gets by and it eats part of what you eat, and it lives inside of you, often or most of the time pretty happily. And in fact, it does. Those communities do really important things for us. They help actually fight off infections because they compete with bacteria that come into the gut that try and cause infections. They also help teach our immune systems actually how to not overreact to certain kinds of stimulants or foods, and people think are contributing to helping to actually prevent things or have there be, say, like less allergies. And of course, bacteria in our gut also help us digest the food we eat, because it turns out that our bodies actually can't absorb all the nutrients that we eat on our own sometimes. How, people might have heard of the microbiome over the past couple of years, and you might be wondering, why are we hearing about it now? People have known about bacteria for about 100 years at least. And what changed in the past 1 or 2 decades is the fact that actually advances in sequencing the human genome all ended up affecting how we study bacteria. So in particular, about 20 years ago, there was a race to sequence the human genome. And what that led to were the development of cheaper and cheaper DNA sequencing machines that, as on this graph shows on the right, the rate at which, or the pace at which the cost of DNA sequencing has come down, thanks to things like the Human Genome Project, has been really, really fast. And what microbiologists have done is take advantage of that to count the bacteria inside of us. It used to be that you would take a petri dish and you would streak out bacteria on it, and you would look at them under a microscope and you would count them by eye, which gets really tiring after a while. And you can only count a couple of hundred. And that's sort of, you've already put in a lot of work. With a modern DNA sequencer, we can count hundreds of millions of bacteria, not by looking at them, but by sequencing their DNA and reading out their stretches of DNA and then matching them to databases of known DNA sequences for different bacteria. So everything that we'll be talking about for the next in our seminar comes to us mostly by sequencing the DNA of bacteria that are inside of people's poop. Okay, and so why might, where have you heard of the microbiome before, or maybe this sounds familiar to you? In particular, there have been a number of, you often see it now in the news where people talk about the microbiome and have associated it with a lot of different kinds of diseases. So things like obesity, different kinds of treatments for heart disease. People have also found associations in studies that involve things like autism or infection or inflammatory syndromes that take place in the gut. And A lot of these associations are still under study. Many of these have been discovered or tested in things like mice. And actively right now, scientists are trying to figure out how many of these associations also take place in people where bacteria are the cause of these associations. And if that's the case, how do we treat them? How do we do things like manage a microbial community and actually get it into a state that is more helpful for people? So in many ways, what scientists are trying to think about now is almost like the role of, say, a forest ranger, where you have something like a forest and you're trying to maintain it and keep it healthy. Microbiologists are studying that right now for the bacteria that live inside of us. So how do we do this? One technique for managing bacterial communities that we've really been very excited about has been studying or has been associated with what we eat. And the reason that we're working on this has to do with actually an experiment that I did with my old research mentor a couple of years ago, back when I was a graduate student, where we had the idea of trying to learn what are all the parts of our daily lives that affect the bacteria that live inside of our guts. And at the time, we didn't really know what the answer was, but we had a lot of ideas. We thought that maybe it had to do with what we eat. We thought it maybe where we went. But you could imagine all kinds of other things too, like how often you exercised, or did you get sick, or did you go on a vacation? Everything that we could possibly think of. I ended up making an app for that to try and track. And the reason I made that app wasn't even, in part was to track it, but also because it was a great excuse to get an iPod, which I had really wanted. And so I got the iPod, I wrote the app, and then we spent a year every day sampling our own microbiomes and then writing down also what we were doing to try and see what kinds of patterns came out of that. Just to give you a sense for all of the data that's collected in a study or an experiment like that, I ended up with all these sort of beautiful maps, actually, I thought, of how in even a single day, our behaviors change. So starting out at midnight, you might be asleep, or you should be asleep. And then over the course of the night, most of the time you're sleeping. And then around 9 in the morning or 8 in the morning, I would wake up, go to work. I would eat lunch around noon, and so on. So we were collecting all of this data about, to the finest possible scale we could, about our lives. And then also we were using the DNA sequencing technology I was telling you about to track the bacteria inside of us. And so these graphs, the one on top and the one on the bottom, these are the two participants in the study. And each of these colored waves here is a different bacterial species inside of us. And you can see that these waves sort of undulate over time. And sometimes they go through these interesting points where they really narrow. And it turned out in that case here, for this participant up here, this person unfortunately got food poisoning. They ate a sandwich that didn't really agree with them. And what ended up happening is we saw this new kind of bacteria inside of them that was, we think, a pathogen or bacteria that causes an infection. But then afterwards, at least some of the bacteria in that person came back. Meanwhile, in the other subject, this is me, there were other kinds of bacteria there, and each of the colors represents a different kind of bacterial species. And then again, there was this period here where there were new bacteria coming into place. And this happened when my wife took a job in Thailand, and I followed her to live with her for a summer, as well as to just eat all of this really yummy Thai food that I loved. And it turned out that doing that probably had an effect on my microbiome. But then coming home over here, which I was sad to leave all of that Thai food behind, my microbiome appears to have gone back to the way it was before I had left. So when we sat down and did some math and tried to figure out exactly what were the things over the course of the year that were shaping our microbial communities, it turned out really interestingly that in this column here, these are the kinds of parts of our days that had some association over here with different bacteria inside of us. And you can see that many of these things actually tended to be what we were eating. So if we were eating fiber, it often came in the form of a fiber breakfast bar. And then other little things, it turns out, was that also yogurt was introducing bacteria into us. And I also mentioned we were also tracking bacteria in our mouth. And flossing, it turned out, got rid of or lowered the abundance of bacteria associated with cavities. So you should really floss, which I don't do as much as I should, given that we did this. So take-home messages from this experiment were that it turns out that actually you saw that many of those waves seemed to be there over the course of an entire year. So that's something that already I thought was really interesting. The bacteria that live in you, the most abundant bacteria, the most common species, are always going to be there, are going to be there for weeks, if not months, for reasons that we don't fully understand yet. They can change, though, in terms of how many of them are there when we travel or when we get sick. And it seemed in particular, one of the biggest impacts on those communities was what we were eating. And so these were these fiber bars that I happened to be eating over the course of a year that appeared to affect my microbiome. So then we wanted to start testing these ideas, because what we were seeing were sort of patterns where two things were happening at the same time, but we didn't really know if they were causing one another. Next, we wanted to do an experiment to see, does eating something actually change the microbiome? Can we test this? Can we make a prediction? And this is something that Sarah will talk more about later on in the talk. This was a first experiment we did to see if we could change the microbiome by feeding people something. The way this study worked was we recruited about a dozen volunteers, and then we prepared two kinds of diets for them. And the diets are depicted here. One diet was based on fruits and on things that came out of plants. So foods that all primarily came from plants. And the reason for that was because plants are a great source of fiber, which is an important nutrient for the microbiome, because fiber ends up getting digested by gut bacteria, and a byproduct of that metabolism is actually a fuel source for our cells that line the epithelium of our gut. We had another diet on the right that was only things that came out of animals. So this was in a way the opposite of the diet on the left. This diet on the right was delicious. It was a lot of yummy barbecue. And then also there were things like cheese, and there were scrambled eggs, and then different kinds of tasty sausages. And what we did was people ate foods from either of these diets over the course of a week. So they went for 1 week on this diet and then another week on that diet. And what we found was that, interestingly, we didn't see as many changes as we thought when people were eating mainly plants. So this line here, or this graph, is showing how people's microbiomes change over time relative to their microbiome before they went on the diet. And then in green here is their microbiome during the diet. And when the line goes up, or when it would have gone up, that would have meant that the number and kinds of bacteria in their guts changed. We found, though, that when people went on the animal-based diet, the number of there were changes in folks' microbial communities that took place actually within about 2 days of going on the diet. And that's actually only 1 day after the food reached their gut. And we knew it only took a day for the food to reach their gut because people ate food coloring that was in the food. And that's how we could tell when the poop came out the other side and it changed color. That's how we knew how long it took for food to get through people. So how does this work, or why does this happen? We've been studying this for a number of years now, and really, it's a really cool, we think, kind of natural ecological system that involves us and not just bacteria. So what happens, we think, is that there are two main compartments to our intestines, the small intestine and the large intestine. Food comes in from the left here and it goes into our small intestine. And it turns out actually that most of the nutrients inside of us, or that we eat, don't end up in the large intestine for bacteria. We actually absorb them. So about 90% of, say, the protein that you eat gets directly absorbed in the small intestine. And that protein is a source of things like nitrogen, which is really important for bacteria to grow. It's almost like a fertilizer for them. So most of that actually gets taken up by us. We're the host for these bacteria. And then some of it, though, actually makes it through to the large intestine, where commensal microbiota, or that means bacteria that normally live inside of us and we don't think cause infection or cause harm, can live off those nutrients. But because there's actually not quite enough of it, it turns out that we've also discovered that we, the host, actually give back some nutrients to bacteria in the gut, and that makes up for the fact that not enough of it is coming through and that we are absorbing most of it. And so what that means is that actually bacteria in the gut typically don't have enough to eat, we think, because much of it is being taken up by us, the host. And a lot of that has to do with bacteria and us, in a way, competing for over the same thing. So it's almost like the us and the bacteria sometimes inside of us aren't always on the same page. And sometimes there might be like almost a little bit of competition to get at food. This is possibly, though, good, or probably good for us, though, because it might be a way that we have some control over our microbiomes, but that might go away when we eat a lot of protein, which is what we think happens in those diets, that when people are eating a lot of animal products. And so now this is how I think of the microbiome. Sometimes you've got all these bacteria that I'm depicting here, making an analogy to things like hyenas and vultures that are all trying to compete for not a lot of resources that live in the gut. Okay, and so now I hope no one was eating lunch during that. I hope it didn't sort of ruin any appetites. Sarah will take over and talk about foods that could help children with obesity.
Great. Thank you so much, Lawrence. I always learn so much listening to you talk about the gut microbiome. And so I guess many of you might be wondering at this point, well, what should I eat so that I can have the healthiest bacteria possible in my intestine? And so we're going to talk a little bit about certain foods and how we're studying these foods can help children. And in this study, it's specifically children who have gained weight too quickly for whatever reason. But really, this applies to everybody in terms of how you can be most healthy and how those foods change their microbiome. So just a little bit of background, and Lawrence, if you want to go ahead and pull the whole slide up, I think that's fine. Thank you. Is that I think everyone has heard in the news that childhood obesity is a global health crisis. This is not something that's just happening in North Carolina. This is happening all over the planet. And we're trying to figure out why. I think sometimes people who have gained weight too quickly feel like they're blamed for that condition. Or maybe their parents feel like they're blamed for that condition. But what we're learning is that there are a lot of reasons why this is happening all over the planet to lots of people. We didn't suddenly have a crisis where everybody lost their willpower all of a sudden. Something else is going on. And we think that the microbiome might be part, at least, of the reason why this is happening to so many children and adults all over the planet. And we do know that some of these microbiome, we call them communities, they're like families of bacteria that live together. They really do play a role in controlling people's weight. So two people who have different microbiomes might eat the exact same thing, and one person might gain weight and one person might not gain weight. So how's that for fair? And so, sometimes I think we have to think about what are all of the things that are going on that causes this. So that's what we're trying to understand better and study with this project we'll tell you about. But first, a little bit of background. So as I mentioned, I'm a pediatrician and I do regular checkups, like many of you might go to see your doctor just once a year to get your height and weight and maybe a vaccine to keep you safe. I also work in a clinic called Healthy Lifestyles. And this is a special clinic for kids who've gained weight too quickly for whatever reason, where we can help provide them with education on what's healthy to eat and try to help them figure out better ways to be active, and also try to understand if there's any kind of medical problems that are either the cause of them gaining weight too quickly or maybe have come as a result of them gaining weight too quickly, like diabetes or high blood pressure, some of those things you think of, only adults having. we're seeing in some kids because of this thing that's going on in the world where kids are just gaining weight too quickly. So on the left is a picture of our clinic. We have a hallway that says Duke Healthy Lifestyles, and we have a nice waiting room with lots of prizes for kids who are coming in and working super hard to make all these hard changes to be healthier in their life. And we even have a little mini grocery store. So for folks that are not sure how to get started or just aren't used to eating some of these different types of foods, we can give people a starter grocery bag and some recipe ideas to get people started. In addition to the clinic, we also have a program that we work with Durham Parks and Recreation called Bull City Fit. And that's a place where kids can go and try some of these new foods. They can be active together and have some fun and make some new friends, because being healthy shouldn't feel like it's punishment. It shouldn't feel like a chore. This should feel like fun. Like, what can I do for my body to help it feel the most energy and feel the most rested, and so that I can do all of the things that I want to do in life. So that's what we do at the Healthy Lifestyles Clinic. So we decided, Lawrence and I kind of put our heads together with a bunch of other scientists and clinical people who are, really care about children and their health. And we said, well, how can we really, help understand what are the foods that kids can be eating to help their microbiome be really healthy so that their bodies can be healthy. And so we came up with this idea for this study that we call Choices. And what we decided to do is just to enroll 40 children, which is kind of a small number of kids overall, just because we're kind of testing out a new idea. Sometimes that's called a pilot project in science. And these are children that all have come to the Healthy Lifestyles Clinic. So they're already trying to get more information about how to be healthy. And the kids are all younger, between 6 and 11 years old. And we want to make sure that they don't have other medical causes for what's going on. So these are just, regular kids that are just seeking a little bit more information. And what we're doing is we are giving them what we came up with as we think is the most microbiome friendly diet we could come up with. And this relies on a lot of science that Lawrence's lab and team have done, and science that other teams all around the world have done, to try and understand what we can recommend to people. So we came up with this sort of, best we could. Here's what we think you should eat. It encourages eating non-starchy fruits. So non-starchy fruits might be things like more like tomatoes are a non-starchy fruit, avocados are a non-starchy fruit, apples are a little starchy, but they have some things in them that help slow it down, as opposed to really starchy and sugary fruits like mango, all the good ones, pineapple, papaya, my favorite. Not that those things are bad foods or that you shouldn't eat them, but they do end up having a lot of sugar in them. And also most vegetables are, they can have fermented foods. You may have heard of like kimchi, if anybody likes that. My kids like spicy kimchi, or drinking kombucha tea is a fermented food. And then if they really like to eat meat and fish, we just recommend grass-fed and wild caught fish. So these are some of the foods that we're recommending on this diet. And what we do is we give people a list so that they have an idea. And we've got, high fiber probiotic foods that come in those categories here on the left. And then foods to kind of like watch out for. We don't want to say you can never eat something because, what do you do if you go to a birthday party and all they have is cake and ice cream? Of course, you're going to celebrate with your friend and have some cake and ice cream, and that's okay. But just things that you might want to have in moderation or over there on the right, because they're things that might grow some of those bad bacteria that Lawrence was talking about. So we give people this handout with these pictures so they have a good idea. Now, one of the challenges that we know is that a lot of families in North Carolina struggle with not having enough food, particularly by the end of the month. So we know that it's helpful to tell people what the healthy foods are to eat, but what if you just can't get those foods? I mean, sometimes, let's be honest, fresh fruits and vegetables are a little more expensive. And it might be hard to get some of the foods that are on that list. We didn't want anyone to be left out. We didn't want anyone to feel like they couldn't do the things that we were asking them to try to do as part of this study. So for the kids in one of the two groups that I'll talk about in a minute, we gave them a subscription to Walmart online grocery, and they have a dietitian that works with their parents to help them do their grocery shopping every week. So we can make sure they can go pick up a bag of groceries for their whole family that will get them those microbiome friendly foods so that this isn't a limitation for anyone. So I mentioned two groups, and you may have heard about this before in your science classes, but a lot of times when we want to understand if something that we think might work actually truly works, we do something called randomize. Okay, and it's just like it sounds. We make things kind of random, like the flip of a coin. So when each of those 40 children that we want to enroll in the study, if they agree and they want to be in the study, we say, okay, we're going to flip a coin. And if it's heads, you're going to be in one group. And if it's tails, you're going to be in another group. We don't actually literally flip a coin. There's a computer program that does that now, but it's basically the same thing. So when they get randomized to the two groups, they get one of two things. One is they get the microbiome diet that I showed you guys that's provided through the Walmart subscription and the online grocery, so they actually get the food. And the other group, we teach them about the microbiome diet and make recommendations, but we let them go ahead and choose their own foods and find it on their own. So we can kind of see what happens in these two different groups. And we're going to do that for 4 weeks with all of these 40 families. And at the end, we're going to check to see how this food affected their diet quality. So was it a high quality diet? Lots of things that we think are healthy for children to grow. And we're going to check their microbiome. And by we, I mean Lawrence's lab is going to do all that work because that's what they're really good at. And they're going to take a look at all those bacteria and tell us a little bit more about how maybe it changed or didn't change and how it changed differently between the two groups who got the food directly or were sort of on their own to go get it. Okay, and I'll pass this part back to you, Lawrence.
Sure. So one of the ways that microbiome research is done, just so everyone knows, when you read about a microbiome study, you might be asking, how do we study bacteria in the gut? Are there people out there volunteering to have scientists go in and take bacteria out of their guts and then study them? There might be people interested in that, but there aren't that many of them around. And so typically what happens instead is that we study bacteria in the gut by studying what comes out of the gut. So we collect poop or stool, and then we analyze that. And so in this study here that Sarah and us are doing together, what happens is that people who participate, when they go to the bathroom, they place a piece of paper underneath their toilet seat. And then when poop comes out, it lands on the toilet paper, on that paper. A little scoop gets taken out, put in the tube that's shown over here, put in an envelope and mailed back to the labs. And then the paper can be removed, the poop falls down, and then it can be flushed. And then one of the other things too that we do with after we analyze the microbiome is that we are always excited to share that information with people who participate in the studies. One, because we think it's really fun to do. And I've always really enjoyed talking to people about their microbiomes when they get to see some of the data about it. I think at least I know that I was always very curious to know what lived inside of me. Also, we think it's just really important to do because everyone who participates in research really is trying to help other people out. And I'm always grateful for people who join in scientific studies because what they're doing is they're helping with their time or even with their bodies and ultimately trying to help scientists and doctors figure out how to make everyone healthier at the end of the day. And so for all of those reasons, we always share with people who join our studies things that they can see inside of them. And we do that, say on the right, by showing the different kinds of bacteria that occur at the different visits. And another thing that we are learning how to do now is actually measure the different kinds of foods that end up inside of stool. So it turns out, another thing to think about is that everything we eat, unless it's just a mineral or a salt. Everything else that we eat comes from something that was alive, and all living things have DNA inside of them. And one of the things that we've learned is that the same kind of DNA sequencing technology that we use to count bacteria can also be used to count food that we eat. And so we can also tell people now some of the different kinds of foods that we see inside of them. We can count the different kinds of fruits, grains, vegetables, even meats. And we do this, and we've found that actually it can vary quite a bit by person and by where they live. And, in different parts of the world, people eat different kinds of foods. And ultimately, one of the other things that we're really interested in learning about as we share these data with people is whether or not this is also helpful for individuals who want to eat certain kinds of foods or eat a healthy diet. Does it help to know that either what you're eating you can see in a report, or that the bacteria inside of you are actually changing when you're doing something hard and trying to eat foods that you might normally not eat? And so that's one of the other questions that we're really interested in. And so speaking of questions, we are happy to answer as many questions as people have. And also, as Sarah said, science is done as a team. And there were many, many scientists at different centers and different schools that performed the research that we shared with you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. I do have a couple of questions here. One of them, well, first of all, somebody said that it was really interesting that your microbiome went back to what it was before after your trip to Thailand, and that it happened so quickly. And so does it mean that the bacteria need to be continuously replenished, or is it just because of the type of food that you are eating that whole microbiome is kind of changing?
That's such a good question. And we don't really know the exact answer yet, I'd say, to that. There are some people think, or some scientists think, that there are ways that bacteria get replenished inside of us, and that things like the appendix, that's what it's used for, like parts of the body that we don't exactly know what they're doing. But it also might be because I went back to eating foods I had eaten before. If you talk to people who study diet, they say that even though it sometimes seems like we might have all these different kinds of foods and eat lots of different places, the average person only knows about 12 different recipes. And so more or less, you're always kind of eating the same thing over time. So to be determined whether or not what exactly caused that. But I agree. I too think that was really interesting. And I think it tends to happen.
Right. Yes, because somebody also was asking, do human populations that seem to have like a longer lifespan have like a particular combination of gut bacteria? So in other words, do you think, well, your diet and your gut bacteria kind of help you in longevity, like how long you will live eventually?
Yeah.
That way we could probably maybe change or adjust our microbiome, right?
Yeah, so people think that, or people have been studying the microbiomes of people who live for a really long time, and especially people who who live longer than 100 years. They think that one thing that always surprises me, or I remember, is how the biggest changes actually happen very early on in life. So the difference between my microbiome and, say, my parents who are in their late 70s is probably not as big as the difference between my microbiome and, say, like a young child, especially one who hasn't started eating solid foods yet. That's also probably the window in time when we can have one of the larger impacts on the microbiome. And for reasons we don't fully know yet, it might be the case that the microbiome gets seeded early on in life and then ends up being the microbiome that you have for many years after that.
Right. Yeah, we also have a question from Marianne. She wants to know, like, does genetics have any role in this? And because there are best types of food and a difference from person to person. So she was wondering if the genetics has any role to play in digesting.
Yeah, Sarah, I don't know if do you want to field that?
Sure. Well, I'll leave the microbiome specific answer to you, Lawrence, but clearly there are differences in individuals by race, by ethnicity, even by gender, that impact how food and what we eat affects our health. For example, we have found, and for reasons that are not entirely clear yet, that children from a Hispanic background are very sensitive to starchy foods, and they seem to develop consequences of overeating on some of these starchy foods. By starchy, I mean like bread, rice, cereal, pasta, potatoes, tortillas, that kind of like the good stuff, right? All the yummy bready stuff. And they tend to get inflammation of their liver. Whereas a child who's from a different race, ethnicity, non-Hispanic white or non-Hispanic African American, can have the same body weight at the same age and being a boy or a girl, just like the child who is Hispanic, but not have inflammation in their liver. So we don't know exactly how genetics play a role in that, but we do know that there's definitely some differences in how different individuals process foods, and maybe related to culturally, evolutionarily over years and years, what people ate from their region and how their bodies adapted to that. And now if you place them in a different environment, their bodies just don't know how to handle some of these foods that they're not sort of, have been adapting to over millennia.
Right. Yes, we also have a question about toddlers, because it seems that it's recommended that toddlers consume full-fat dairy instead of low-fat for brain development. And so Miranda wanted to know, is it better to avoid animal fats and get fats from, like, for instance, avocados or any type of plant resources?
Yeah, this is a very good question and a little bit of a hot topic in pediatric nutrition. And there are people on both sides of this issue. Currently, the recommendations are for most children to switch to low-fat milk at age 2, unless they have weight problems themselves by that early age, or there's like a strong family history of weight problems. Then they can switch to full fat if they don't have any of those problems. However, I have looked at this before, and it's really clear that we don't see any health consequences of full fat dairy. So, I would always prefer the unprocessed version of foods versus the processed version of foods.
Right.
But there is some microbiome evidence that Lawrence can describe about dairy and how that impacts our microbiome. So it is certainly reasonable to get fat from avocados and seeds and nuts and all those other good plant-based sources. It's just really important for toddlers they get calcium as well. And there are some plant-based sources of calcium. You just have to be a little savvy, like almonds, for example, have a lot of calcium. Leafy greens can have large amounts of calcium. So you just have to be a little bit more intentional about finding that. But as long as you're meeting their daily requirements, then I tell parents that that's okay if they don't want to give their children cow milk.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. I do have also another question, and it's more about when we looked at the microbiota, how that changed during the day. And so one of the questions would be like, is it that the microbiota also has like a daily rhythm? Like, is it also like active during certain times of day, or is it just constant?
Yeah, so it's thought that they do have daily rhythms, and that those rhythms are entrained by our daily rhythms, because, as you can imagine, right, we eat only at certain parts of the day and we sleep during other parts of the day. And so, in fact, as you might expect, the times when food reaches the gut shortly after eating, those are times when the microbiome ends up being more active. So they do have daily cycles.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, because I mean, it's certain that, you know, all the type of food that you're eating and your lifestyle also has like a big influence on, you know, your health and stuff like that. So, you know, it's just mind blowing that those microbiota also have their written, you know. There is also another question about the microbiome and alcohol. So, what does alcohol do to the microbiome?
That's a good question, and one that I've had a lot of curiosity about because of, as Sarah said, there are a lot of delicious fermented drinks, things like kombucha, that also can have alcohol in them. It hasn't been very well studied, and so I can't tell the person with the question, unfortunately, exactly what the effects are.
Right. So is that something that you're possibly gonna, you know, invest or research using your app, or?
Well, if anyone would like to volunteer for a kombucha study, maybe that's something that we
That
can
would be
happen.
very interesting. Yes, yes. I think you will find some people that might be interested in that. So there's also somebody that said, I'm glad you mentioned processed food. Does processed foods have an adverse effect on the microbiome? Or is it better to just eat processed food if it is also as good stuff, you know, like the fiber bars and things like that? Because that's processed, but it's kind of like advertised as being or marketed as being healthy. So I don't know who wants to take that question.
Lawrence, I'll just say a word about processed foods in general, but I would certainly defer to you on their impact on the microbiome. But, you know, particularly with children, because that's the study that, you know, we're talking about. Hopefully we won't be doing that alcohol consumption study in this group. But, you know, with children, it's, you know, it's really like swimming upstream, isn't it, to try and avoid processed foods, because kid food by definition tends to be very processed, the way that it's marketed and sold. And even in restaurants, you might have, you know, beautiful options laden with vegetables on the regular menu. And then you go to the kids menu and it's all fries and chicken nuggets, you know, with maybe a side of applesauce if you're lucky. So, you know, it really does tend to be lean towards heavily processed foods. I have a couple concerns about this. One is that fiber is very broken down the more that foods are processed. And so the really healthy part of the fiber, which is the husk sort of around the germ in the middle, is stripped away. And all you're getting is the inside core, which doesn't have the same benefits as the outside. So I think from a health perspective, it's less healthy. Also, there tend to be a lot of fillers and additives that, you know, we either do know what they do to the body and it's not good because it's sugars and, you know, chemicals, or maybe worse is we don't know what they do to the body because these things are not, you know, not really food. They're preservatives and not necessarily meant to be consumed. So I do have concerns about that health-wise, but maybe the most important thing is that I think it's important that children develop healthy habits early in life, which is why I always get back to just, you know, helping them understand where their food comes from, experimenting with foods, tasting it, maybe take a bite. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat more, but trying to play with it a little bit and have it be a fun experiment, but with real foods that you can say this, you know, these raspberries came from California all the way to our plate here. Let's taste them and see if we can taste the sunshine that helped them grow. Or, you know, this yam grew in a farm that's only 10 miles up the road from us. So this, you know, really came from right nearby. Let's, you know, thank the farmer for, you know, who grew this for us as we're tasting it. So just being more connected to the foods, which is just hard to do when the food's very processed.
Yeah, and just to follow up, because I realized too, I certainly don't want to send a message that I didn't mean to. I am not encouraging people to eat fiber bars per se. When one of the interesting things that came out of that study to me was that how there could be associations with sort of foods that you might not necessarily, or that I was eating without trying to impact my microbiome. But it wasn't certain. I don't think, and I don't tell my kids this because I have 2 young kids, I certainly am not telling them to eat fiber bars all the time for exactly the reasons that Sarah said. It's really interesting. The bacteria that have evolved to live in our guts, one of their favorite things to eat is what Sarah said are these fibers that are found on the outside, often of like fruits and vegetables. And that when we process them, or when they're processed, that those nutrients that gut bacteria love disappear. And so even things now, like I try not to peel the apples that my kids eat because there's all this yummy pectin for bacteria on the skin of those apples, things like that. I think microbiologists are realizing that it's amazing how all the foods, or how the fruits and vegetables that people have been eating for a really long time, it appears that the bacteria that are inside of us are really almost poised to eat those parts of foods. And when they're more processed and then mixed with other kinds of additives or chemicals and emulsifiers that haven't traditionally been parts of diets, that's where it's less clear what exactly how that might help the microbiome.
Right. Yes, and that's actually, that kind of leans towards another question that somebody had is, how have your studies actually affected your lives? So what do you do now, or what did you change now? I guess you stopped eating all those processed, fiber bars, or maybe there was something else that you realized that you wanted to do?
I can go first and then maybe give Sarah. Yeah. So I'll say that I also don't want to send a message I didn't mean to, which is to necessarily say that particularly doing things like eating meat is bad. I really enjoy eating many different kinds of meats and do so. And it's for reasons that I think Sarah was talking about earlier. What we choose to eat isn't necessarily like a scientific equation. We eat foods often because they remind us of home, or they remind us of our family, and they're things that we grew up eating. And so I still eat all kinds of foods that probably shouldn't be, or that would be on, the right side of that diagram that Sarah was saying, because those are important to me. And I feel important, or it feels important to me also, that my children learn about those foods because that's where my parents came from and it reminds us of home. Mm-hmm. I think that certainly, though, one thing that I've taken away from this, at least, is to moderate and to not necessarily eat more of one kind of food than I normally might have, and instead remember that I'm eating it because it gives me these warm feelings and makes me happy, and I don't have to eat a lot of it to still have that feeling.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with Lawrence. I think you have to be able to be adaptive, to where you are. And if you get too rigid about what you're going to eat and not eat, you can get yourself all kind of tied up in knots when you're in a situation that should be a fun situation, like families going out to eat or something like that. So you should be flexible. And as Lawrence pointed out with the science, your microbiome is very flexible. It changes day to day and can change right back. I think what I try to focus on for myself and my family is more of the good stuff, but not rules about what we can't have. So, let's just try and make sure that every day we get something, that's good for us and that nourishes us, but not try to say we can't have this, or there's no list of things that are forbidden. It's just trying to make sure we get in the good stuff too.
Right. Yeah. Well, this has been a really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It's almost time for us to go. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Sarah Armstrong, and Dr. Lawrence David for the talk. I for sure have learned a lot. So I'm sure you all have too. If you have any links or something that you can, or any things that you can share with us, please, you can always send that to us and we will send that to our viewers. I do also want to thank our sponsors, the North Carolina Science Festival and Biogen Foundation. And I also want to extend that thank you to our Friends of the Museum members who support us every single day and who makes events like this actually possible. So we do have a lot of other programs scheduled for this week. And we actually gonna put that in the chat so that you can click on that as well. And if you wanna see this again, we have actually recorded it, so you can always go to our SciTech website to view it again. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed it too. And I would say I hope to see you in another program. Thank you so much, Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Lawrence David. Bye. Have a good day.
Thanks for all the questions.
That was really, really awesome. Very interesting.
Good, I'm glad. Well, thank you for inviting us, and take care.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.